to see. So welcome everybody. Launch today. We're going to just take a few minutes to make sure that everybody's in the room. So I'll be waiting for a signal from someone from my team to let me know that we think we've got everybody who's signed up in. We have some really exciting speakers here today, and I'll introduce them shortly. But in the meantime, please just make yourself comfortable. You will be able to see us and all the panelists. You won't be able to see the other participants, but you will be able to chat to each other via the chat function. So yeah, make yourself comfortable, and I will bring us all into the room shortly with the other participants in a moment. Hi, Terry, great to see you here. Ted, lovely to see you too. Please do use the chat to introduce yourselves to each other so everyone knows who's here, and if you want to just have a side conversation about anything that piques your interest as we go as well. Mandy, hello, lovely to see you here too. Kerry. Oh, this is lovely. I wish I could see everyone's faces. It's just so nice to see everyone's names. I'm not going to read all the names out because they're streaming in thick and fast now, but that's really great. We've got 60 people here now. Helena, just tell me when you think we've got a reasonable amount of everybody who is booked on.
Will do. I think we're up to 100, so we'll
wait a little bit
60
longer.
At the moment. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, everyone's turned up incredibly promptly, which is absolutely wonderful. So I think I will just kick off in a couple more minutes. Fantastic. Okay. Welcome, everybody. My name's Kate Surety. I'm the Chief Executive of Action Hampshire, and we are absolutely delighted to be able to welcome you all here to this State of the Sector report. It's something that we've done every few years or so, but I don't think there's ever been a point where there's been such incredible, phenomenal, unprecedented, all of those words that we're so familiar with now, change in the meantime. So I think this is probably a really worthwhile piece of research for us all as a sector to reflect on and consider, and take our time doing that, actually, because there will be more changes to come, I'm sure. So really, really helpful to have this seminar to take us all through it as well. I'm delighted to be able to introduce you to some of our speakers. So we have Abby Facey, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Yellow Brick Road Projects, and she'll be talking us through some of her stuff a bit later. Also Kate Christie, who is the Chair of Trustees for Thruxton Memorial Hall. So we have a different kind of perspective there as well. And of course, Leah Campbell, who's Action Hampshire's Head of Charitable Activities, and she'll be taking us through the meat of the report. And we will be circulating an awful lot of this afterwards as well, in lots of different ways. So just some brief housekeeping first, as you're already doing, please do use the chat to communicate with each other, comment on what's happening, make connections, all of that stuff. That would be absolutely fantastic. There is also, because this is a webinar, there's also a Q&A. And as we go along, it would be great if you could add your questions to specific speakers into the Q&A function. And what we'll do when we get to the Q&A is I will be coming back to that, picking those questions out and putting them to our speakers and our panelists here today. So please do use both. We also have Helena, who is going to keep an eye on the chat and keep an eye on the slides and all of those things as well. So hopefully we'll be as smooth as we possibly can. It really will benefit from your questions, your active participation, Dave. So really welcome that. And I guess finally, I'd like to say a huge thank you to all of our partners in the Hampshire CVS Network. This is a collaborative piece of work that we deliver at Action Hampshire, but very much in collaboration with the rest of the CVSs within the sector. And also a huge acknowledgement and thanks to all the participants, and the hundreds of participants one way or another through the surveys and everything else, who've helped us create this picture that we have in front of us. And it is a very, very rich picture. We are now up to 72 participants, and I'm just looking over to Leah, who is our first speaker. Are you ready there, Leah? Excellent. I'm going to put myself on mute and I will be joining the chat as well. And I'll hand over to Leah. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Kate, and hello everyone. Thanks for taking time out of your busy days to join us for this session. I'm going to talk you through some of the findings from the report. It's quite a long report, and so there's lots in there, but I'm going to try and highlight some of the key findings, things that I thought really stood out of the way that COVID has impacted the state of the voluntary, community and social enterprise sector. So if we can go to the next slide, the first part of my presentation, which will only be about 10-15 minutes, is to introduce you to what falls between that category of Hampshire's voluntary, community and social enterprise sector. What does that mean? So I'm going to start with that. If we go to the next slide, this is a sample of one of the visualizations that you'll find if you go to our website, and we'll put the link in the chat, so you can do that if you haven't already had a look. Of a accompanying visualization we've produced to go alongside the report. And I thought I'd include it here when I'm talking about kind of what sorts of organizations fall within our sector. So when we say the VCSE sector, we mean volunteer-led groups, community groups, social enterprises. We mean charities, trusts and foundations, community buildings, mutual aid groups, community sports groups, community arts groups, and loads of others. And so it's quite a diverse sector, and that's something I'll come back to in a second. If we go to the next slide, another way to kind of think about an introduction to the sector is to look at some headline numbers. We have an estimated 10,218 VCSE organizations in Hampshire. That's including Portsmouth and Southampton, because the organizational footprint, where organizations work, don't exactly follow our statutory setup. So that's across Hampshire as a whole, not just the technical county. Most of those organizations are small, unregistered groups. So if you remember what the last slide looks like, that big purple circle, that was all the unregistered community and voluntary groups, and they're the biggest. We have official numbers for registered charities. We get that from the Charity Commission, and how we've arrived at the total figures is using a standard calculation for what are called under the radar groups, and that's what we've used. So that's where we get that figure from. And using that, we can also calculate then the number of volunteers and staff we have in Hampshire in the VCSE sector. So we have over 180,000 volunteers. That 91.6% of organizations that answered our survey have volunteers. So volunteers are truly an essential part of the sector. Although not every organization calls volunteers, some might call them supporters or members, or in the case of mutual aid groups, neighbors. There are also almost 55,000 members of staff. 68% of these are part-time. And that's a kind of percentage that's persisted since the first data we have on the sector from 2009. As I said on the last slide, the sector has a huge variety within it. There are a wide variety of organizations and a wide variety of experiences. And that's really the kind of headline message of how has COVID impacted the sector? Well, it depends which part of the sector, which organization you're from, because you have organizations who were a bustle of activity during the pandemic, and others who had to shut their doors and have really found it difficult to get going again since. You have organizations that face significant income and capacity loss and challenges, and others who've flourished, who've expanded their operations and were able to access funding more easily than they ever were before. There is not one pandemic experience of the sector, but there are many trends and themes, and that's the sort of thing that we're going to go through today. So if we go to the next slide, the rest of my presentation is structured in terms of 8 ways the pandemic has impacted the sector. So if we go to the first one, the first impact that I want to point out to you is disruption to activities. Whether because of physical premises having to shut, activities going online, staff who ran activities being on furlough, volunteers who ran activities, shielding, regular activities that VCSE organizations were holding had to be put on hold, had to shift, had to go online. Activities were disrupted. If we just switch to the next slide, 80.6% of organizations that answered the surveys that contributed to this research report having to stop their activities, at least some of their activities, at least once during the pandemic. 74.69% described this as being unable to carry on as normal. And as of the time of the survey, when we collected data, which was around July, August of this year, 10.94% had not yet restarted activities. And so the disruption that the pandemic has had really is one of the standout kind of impacts that I'd like to highlight. If we go on to the next slide, the second impact I'd like to share is the complexity of needs. So, you know, I don't think that it's a surprise or a new finding to say that the pandemic has had such a widespread impact on our society, you know, across the board, not just our sector in terms of mental health and loneliness, and also, you know, the other things that have happened in the last 18 months in terms of a much greater awareness around racial inequalities and climate change and all those sorts of things as well. So there has been quite a kind of societal impact of the last 18, or it's probably more than, I should stop saying 18, it's probably more like 20, 21 months now. Many VCSE organizations already support marginalized or seldom heard groups or individuals and families who need support in some way. That's part of the core mission or purpose of many VCSE organizations. And the pandemic has exacerbated those sorts of challenges and made them more complex. It's very difficult for us to put numbers on this. This is one area of the report where we don't have much in the way of numbers, because the research was about what the impact has been on organizations, not communities. But in the words that those organizations, you know, shared with us, you see the impact that the pandemic has had on the communities that the organizations that we looked at serve. So organizations described a significant rise in mental health issues, a loss of confidence, loss of independence, in some areas, increased levels of poverty, and also physical health issues as well as mental health. And there were also quite a few concerns for both younger people who faced a lot of disruption to their education, to the kind of usual rites of passage, you know, ending school, going into employment and so on, as well as to older people due to the amount of shielding and isolation that they had to go through. However, this doesn't necessarily mean, even though there's a complexity of needs, that there was an increase in demand for all organizations. And we did ask some questions in the report about demand, and there are quite a few organizations that had experienced having, you know, lower interest and needs for their organization. And so what we've emphasized is that demand doesn't necessarily correlate with need. The need is absolutely there, and it's more complex. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, and number 3, this one is about the impact on staff well-being. The pandemic really took a toll on mental health. I mentioned that already, and 57% of organizations said that the pandemic has had a negative impact on staff. A lot of it was described as because of change. the changing rules, the ups and downs, the being allowed to do this, now we won't be able to do that. And for a sector full of people who are motivated and in this line of work or in this line of giving with their time as volunteers, by their desire to help and support others, to make an impact, not being able to do that, being surrounded by people who are facing a more challenging time and not being able to solve that, had a huge impact on the well-being of staff working in the sector. And that's kind of rippled through to challenges with recruitment. An extremely high figure, 71.43% of organizations who we asked about this say it's now harder to recruit staff than it was before the pandemic. That's really stand out for me. However, on a positive note, there was a real opportunity in the pandemic and the ways that it kind of forced organizations to adapt and work in different ways. And the degree that things like mental health were in, everyone's social conscience. Things like work-life balance, trialing hybrid working, just being more in touch with staff well-being are positive impacts that organizations that we interviewed and surveyed mentioned. So if we go on to the fourth one, as well as staff, we have volunteers. About 41% of organizations said they've experienced decreased volunteer numbers, and organizations particularly noticed the loss of older volunteers who had to shield, and some of whom continue to be wary and not yet comfortable returning to face-to-face volunteer roles that they had previously. And while the furlough period provided a kind of temporary injection of more people who had the time on their hands because they were furloughed from their normal work to be able to give time, and there were some kind of temporary increases of volunteer capacity, overall, over 40% of organizations are now finding it more difficult to recruit new volunteers compared to before the pandemic. And smaller organizations seem to have the most difficulty with this because they're already often themselves volunteer run. And so they're experiencing that kind of pressure and weight of that. Again, like I said in my opening slide about the diversity, on the other hand, 23.5% of organizations saw an increase of volunteers. So this is not a universal experience, but it's one that has significant enough numbers that we should have a think about what we can do as a sector to support organizations struggling to recruit volunteers. Alongside this one is impact number 5, which is a surge of what we describe as spontaneous volunteering, more ad hoc opportunities to volunteer, as well as the addition of many new VCSE groups, including over 185 mutual aid groups in Hampshire who formed during the pandemic. And while the people who support mutual aid groups don't necessarily all consider themselves volunteers, if we think about, volunteers as people supporting VCSE organizations without pay, we can group them together in this category. Some of the mutual aid groups, we did interview a number of them for the research, and some of them were only for the pandemic. They were a kind of spontaneous gathering, and they've disbanded and faded away. Other groups have now formalized and become charities or other sorts of structures and will continue to be part of the VCSE sector going forward. And there was also spontaneous volunteers who joined and supported the volunteer centers that the CVS organizations in Hampshire led and joined to support neighbors in a more ad hoc way. And so it's now I think an important process, and there is some work underway to try and understand how to harness this community spirit of all of those who came forward and got involved in either a mutual aid group or their local volunteer center, and how to kind of harness that and help to try and fill some of the volunteering gaps that organizations who haven't benefited from the surge of volunteers yet still need. On to the sixth impact. This one is about digital confidence and the kind of forced hand that many organizations had to suddenly get online and use new technology at a rate that just was accelerated. It just was like pressing the fast forward button, some organizations described. Between working from home and having Zoom meetings to delivering services online, the path to digital really was accelerated. And 57.69% of those who answered this question said they felt more confident with digital technology following the pandemic. 68.4 organizations did increase their use of digital technology, and most of these expect this increase to continue. What's interesting is that not everyone does. So I think that alongside the digital confidence, there's also a lot of digital fatigue. And there's also a kind of difference between the sorts of ways that organizations had to take on digital in terms of delivering services online that might not continue, but what does that mean in terms of other sorts of digital solutions that they might be more capable of taking on now? So there's some work to be done about what the digital future looks like for VCSE organizations in Hampshire. The next one is about income. 45.96% of organizations saw a decrease in their funding during the pandemic. And again, not everyone. So 26.28% had their income increased. The decrease was often due to a lack of being able to do usual fundraising efforts like donations from the public or fundraising events, as well as any trading income, as well as access to long-term grant funding, a lot of which was put on hold to make room for the COVID-specific grant programs, which were plentiful and a huge and significant help to organizations to get through the pandemic. There's a lot of really positive, impactful feedback in the report about how much these grant programs helped, and also how funders made processes simpler and funding easy to access at a time when it was really needed. However, most of this funding appears to be short-term and project-based. And so while it helped organizations get through the first year or so, or the first year and a half, it won't necessarily continue. The reality is that the true impact to organizational income will be more apparent in years to come, once the COVID funds have all been spent, and once organizations kind of see whether their previous funding opportunities or any new opportunities do emerge. And that brings me on to the eighth final impact that I'm going to share, which is the overall sustainability of organizations. So as part of the research, we looked into whether the pandemic had led to organizations closing, and we did find a few. Most of the organizations that had already been losing capacity and resource, really losing steam for some time, and just found the pandemic to be the final straw. But so far, there doesn't seem to have been a significant change in terms of patterns of how many organizations start and close over time. And I think, unfortunately, this doesn't mean that everyone's got through it and will be fine. It means that this impact has yet to be realized. We don't know. Once the dust settles more and all the options have been tried, more organizations might be forced to close. 44.68% of organizations have had to dip into their reserves to get through the pandemic, and this reduces their resilience to further shocks. The main two needs that organizations describe are funds and capacity. They need to solve the staff and volunteer recruitment issues that I mentioned already. It hasn't been within the scope of this research to quantify the value that VCSE organizations contribute to Hampshire. That's not the purpose of this report. But if you do read the report, you get a sense of this anyway, qualitatively, because in looking at how the pandemic impacted the sector, you see what a significant role the sector had actually in communities responding to the pandemic. This value is significant. And so losing organizations would be a loss to Hampshire, and more support is needed for VCSE organizations. And there is some recommendations within the report about ways that organizations such as the CVS Network, as well as the council and funders, can do to advocate for the sector going forward. So my last slide is just to suggest where you can learn more. You can read the report. There's lots more details with graphs of all the figures I've mentioned, spotlight features on community buildings, mutual aid groups, social enterprises, and so on. Lots of quotes and those recommendations I mentioned. On the same site, you'll find some interactive visualizations like the bubble diagram I showed you, and there's even some results from the survey that you can interact with and choose which questions you want to compare to which, and have a real interactive play with the results. At our annual general meeting next week, we'll be having some breakout discussions inspired by some of the themes from this report, so you can come along there and discuss. And if you have any other ideas of how this information can be used, this information can lead from insight into action, you want to brainstorm and talk about how to use the recommendations from the report, please do get in touch. I'm really keen to hand back to Kate and other speakers and let you hear a bit more about their experiences. So thanks so much. Back to Kate.
Thank you, Leah. That was brilliant. And there's been a really great chat going on as well. So just to draw attention to some of the things that people have been talking about, the impact of digital, that switch to digital and how it doesn't replace face-to-face communication, that's come out really strongly. And also Ross Borman has just let people know his contact details about some work around mental health and wellbeing, which may well be really useful for lots of organisations on the line here today. So thank you, and that is, there is such a lot in this report, and it's great to have someone take us through it in the way that you just did, Leah. I'd like to go now to Abby. So Abby, if you'd like to unmute yourself and just tell us a little bit about yourself and the organisation, and also the experience from your perspective, that would be brilliant.
Thank you. Hello, my name's Abby Facey, and I'm the Chief Operations Officer with Yellow Brick Road Projects. I'm not the Chief Executive Officer, but growth mindset yet. So basically, our organisation exists, and our vision is to see an end to youth homelessness. We work with young people up to the age of 35, and we do that through a variety of ways, and 3 strands really. One is through our accredited life skills programme, You Matter, which teaches people the skills they need to get and keep a tenancy. The second way is working with young people who have adverse childhood experiences or adverse community environments, and supporting those young people either through our You Matter in School programme, through detached youth work, through our programme, the Legacy Project, which is working with young people who are at risk of or involved in criminal exploitation, and lastly through detached youth work. And then the third strand of what we do is working with other professionals and people in training, for example, social workers, and really hearing the experiences of the people that we work with and the challenges that people we work with face, using those to help inform practice in the future. So I was just having a think really about our response to coronavirus, and it's really great to have an opportunity to reflect on the journey that we've been through. The initial response, I thought, well, what's the initial response? I went home and cried and felt quite sick and had a migraine, which I've since realised is my stress signature, and that's what happens to me when I'm worried about things. And then I started to think about the whole thing. I'm a daughter of someone in the Navy, and I started to think about the whole thing as a storm, and thinking about how we responded, so how we faced the storm of corona. So initially what we did was we pivoted our services online, and that was our You Matter programme, our You Matter 2 programme, so working with people who've already completed You Matter to train to become peer mentors, and also our Growing Together Young Parents programme. We were able to deliver all of those things online with varying degrees of success, I would say. So the positives were that for You Matter, it meant that we could carry on working with the people we'd always been working with in the community. That was really positive. For You Matter 2, we were actually able to capture a wider number of people to work with who had already done You Matter, but perhaps we initially thought, oh, we're going to deliver this course in Andover, but actually what we were able to do is deliver it across Hampshire and into West Sussex for people who had already completed the You Matter programme. And the Growing Together group, I think working with young parents online was particularly challenging. So it was good to have that offer, but wasn't really what they were looking for. In terms of You Matter and You Matter Too, what we, aside from the fact that we were able to reach people from a wider area, it also meant that we could connect with people when they felt most isolated. So we would work with people at times that were convenient for them. We looked at delivering some of our sessions in the evening when children had gone to bed, or which is an opportunity when parents were most able to focus, but also at a time when they felt most lonely and disconnected from people. And I just remember one of our learners saying, everything I'd built around myself, my scaffold to support me, is gone, and the shutters have come down. And that was kind of her real life feeling, and it felt very important to respond to that. The next part, in terms of how we weathered the storm, is just equipping ourselves for the journey. So we connected with young people ourselves, and we looked at the services that we were already delivering and how lots of our nominations came from other organisations into our service. And actually, if those other organisations didn't look like they had originally, were they connecting with people? Were they able to connect with people? And therefore, were they able to then refer them into our services? And the answer was no, not really. So schools were a really good example of that. So we decided that if we weren't going to receive the nominations in that way, we'd go out and find people ourselves. So we did that through detached youth work, going out and meeting young people in the places they chose to spend time. That was quite challenging, and we know from young people that they felt even when they were able to go to school, they were able to mix with lots of people, but socially they were not able to do that outside of school, and they found that a real challenge to kind of understand those two different messages that they were receiving. We also worked with DEFRA, with Clarion Futures and UK Harvest and Finkley Down Farm, and we created meals that came from, basically there were lots of P&O cruises that were due to go out, that weren't able to. And so we had the ingredients and the things that were on ship, and we used those to create meals to deliver to families in hostels who had things like venison curry. And it was a really good way of connecting with people at a time when they felt isolated, they felt very thought of, but also that, you know, money and finances were tight with people not able to work or furloughed. And it was a great way of creating that connection with people. And another thing that we did was to create some fuel bars. So we, again, using the same kind of pot of funding, we made some healthy sort of cereal bars, and we delivered them to schools across Test Valley. And the idea about it was about holding a conversation, not a detention. So if a young person was late to school, rather than saying, you know, why are you late? Come back after school and see me. It was about what's happened in your morning, have something to eat, and a more compassionate conversation. So it felt like some of the things that we're trying to do as a trauma-informed organisation, we were able to support other people to have those conversations and to get those messages across. And on the back of those, there was a QR code, which just, if people scanned, they were able to see lots of services that were available to local families that they connect with. And lastly, in terms of equipping ourselves for the journey, we provided tech to people that weren't able to get online themselves. So that might be laptops, it might be Wi-Fi, which was a very interesting experience to provide people with dongles. We work with very entrepreneurial people sometimes, and sometimes those dongles weren't used for the things they were supposed to. So we hoped it would just be used for Wi-Fi, but a dongle can very easily be broken open and SIM card popped into a mobile phone, which is a whole other kind of bill. So there's definitely some learning from us in terms of how those are used and how they're given to people. The next thing that we did was we battened down the hatches, and I can see that Susie, our Chair of Trustees, is part of the audience, and I just remember her talking about sort of weathering the storm and how we, you know, at some points we're going to need to batten down the hatches. Everyone's feeling overwhelmed, and how long can we go on this journey for? So we really made sure that we looked after our team, and that's something that I'm really proud of as part of Yellow Brick Road projects, that we're able to do that. We had weekly wellbeing sessions with our team online, so people could join in if they wanted or were able, and we did all sorts of things. We sang, we talked, people read stories, we just brought different things to the table each week. And it was a really lovely way to connect with other people, and while we were remote working, still feeling like we were part of a team. And we also brought in someone to offer some mindful self-compassion sessions for our team as well, which we had once a month, which again were really valued by people as a time just to stop and spend some time on themselves, which was really good in terms of then being able to top up other people's glasses from our jug. So looking towards the horizon and steadying our ship, we really then kind of going forward, just focusing on what we do, developing our strategy and making sure that we don't have any kind of mission creep. So thinking about things like the meals are really important, but we're not a meal provider. The fuel bars are really important, but maybe that's not our best kind of use of our resource, travelling 60 miles across Thames Valley to deliver the fuel bars. But actually, are they things that could be taken on by other services? It doesn't just have to be us that's delivering that. And an example of that is I've been talking to the mediation service in Portsmouth about the fuel bars and thinking about them as restorative bars, and actually how can we use those to get into local schools and emphasise a restorative message with some training that goes along with the staff. We really have been very fortunate. Our team has grown. We've got more people on board, which is amazing in this time to be able to say that. And we're delivering a hybrid service. So now our services are still online sometimes. We're able to work with people over a wider area, not just Hampshire. I've delivered groups this week to people that have been in Dorset, in Bristol, in Hampshire, in Devon. And the amazing thing about it also is that where sometimes people would have come into a group, before they would have said to us, who's going to be there? Who's going to be there? Who do I know from my community, from my school? Maybe those people that remembered me from before, and people feeling quite nervous about that. There's something quite igniting, I suppose, about being able to go into a group and not know anybody. And for some people, that's a real positive. They can just be whoever they want to present on that actual day, rather than all the things that have gone on in their past and people knowing them just for that. And we've been able to do some of our work face-to-face again. So particularly thinking about things like those young parents that have found themselves in hostels, having babies during the pandemic, and not feeling so supported by services, being able to open up a room once a week for young parents and see those kids just have the run of the whole room, but also parents to connect and support one another has been really, really important. And we've been able to continue with our detached youth work. We've gotten back into schools, hooray. That's taken a long time to be able to do, but we are back in schools working again, and delivering still our legacy project, both virtually and face-to-face. So I think for us going forward, hybrid will be the way, and it's just shown us some opportunities of things we couldn't have done before, and that is a reach to the shore. Thank you.
That's absolutely fantastic. There's some, I hope you get a moment just to take a look at some of the chat that's come through on that as well, Abby. Really, really fantastic stuff. And there's some great themes there. I'll pick them up at the end because I know we've got quite a bit more to get through still. Kate, can I turn to you now to take us through a little bit of your experience at Thruxton Memorial Hall in the past 18 months? I will do my muting.
Right. Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Kate, for asking me to join you. Thruxton Memorial, well, after that last presentation, I feel a little bit like, probably the ugly sister. Abby, that was brilliant. And I think you should be very proud of yourself. Thruxton Memorial Hall and us. Can I have the first slide, please? Thruxton is in North Hampshire, near Andover. We're a tiny, tiny village. There are only 660 of us, but I do think that in many ways we are a representative of a glimpse of what the situation was for many, if not all, village halls and some community centres. We are in North Hampshire, as I said. There are 660 people live in Thruxton, and in 2019, we were thrilled and very honoured to receive the Small Village of the Year award, in no small part, I think, because of the immense generosity and community spirit there is in Thruxton, which never ceases to amaze any of us. It is quite astounding. During lockdown, we're a grade 2 listed building, which is lovely. As you can see, it's a very beautiful building. It's quite a nice photograph of it, actually. which being grade 2 listed is lovely, but it causes all kinds of problems. Our turnover is approximately 22,000 a year in a good year, not the last year, obviously. And during lockdown, of course, the hall just closed completely. And we were able then, after some very confusing messages from the government about what we could and couldn't do, we were able to open the hall and use as a store for what we called our virus volunteers. This was a group of local people who set up, there were about 12 of them, I think, and they just went around the village, found out who was vulnerable, who was needy, who needed prescriptions collected, food and whatever. A local supermarket donated a load of food to us, and we were able to distribute that. We also had a collection in the village, so some essential supplies were actually purchased, but we were able to offer the hall as a store. Could I have my next slide, please? I suppose our greatest achievement during lockdown was to apply for a lottery grant. We needed our boiler replaced in the kitchen on the wall, and I had the idea that I wanted to set up a community cafe. Thruxton is a village of people who our demographic tends to be to the older end age group. So with this grant, we were able to purchase, we weren't allowed to use anything that was comestible, so we couldn't buy tea or coffee or cake or anything, but we were able to buy plates and paper cups and all the things, masks, hand sanitizers and things like that, to make our community cafe set up. And Thruxton Love Cake was born in our car park. Could I have the next slide, please? As I said, we realized that our demographic was on the upper end, and this is a photograph of TLC a couple of weeks ago at our Macmillan coffee morning. As you can see, we don't always get these kind of numbers, but during lockdown, or when lockdown was easing and people could go out, it was a great place for some of our residents to meet. We've talked in the report about loneliness and isolation, and I think it's really important, we felt in the village it was really important that we give a place for people to meet safely. The weather was on our side, we were able to do it in the car park. I'd like to think we were socially distanced. We separated the tables, we put the chairs out specially, and then people just picked up their chairs, walked to the main table and all sat round. In some ways it was lovely, but in other ways it was a nightmare. But it was a great success, and it was amazing to us that we attracted a different kind of demographic than we were expecting. Could I have the next slide, please? What we found out was that we had young people in the village too. And suddenly all these young mums came out with their children, and our car park never looked so colourful. A few residents nearly had heart attacks when they saw the mess, but it rained and the next day and everything was cleared up. But it was lovely to see these children just suddenly just playing together and just being able to have a bit of fun. Next slide, please. All grants received through government, we got all the grants, the business grants from TVBC. I have to compliment them. Their staff were absolutely wonderful. Where we were a little uncertain or whatever, the staff just really helped talk us through it. And without the government grants, without any doubt, we would have been absolutely dead in the water, to use Abby's analogy. I think, in fairness, the grants not only made up for the shortfall in our income, but actually gave us a little bit of breathing space and allowed us to bring forward some of our maintenance programme. As you can imagine, in a grade 2 listed building, our repairs take ages, they're very expensive, they have to be done to a degree that you wouldn't perhaps expect normally. And therefore we need good reserves for the unforeseen. And also But actually having this little bit of money made us able to do things like we run a cinema evening, but suddenly we had enough money, which we'd never had before, to buy our own screen so that we'll be able to run films more regularly. And again, one of the things I particularly want to do is run sort of maybe Fred Astaire afternoons, so that again, some of our older residents can come into the hall and watch a movie in a nice atmosphere that they wouldn't see at home normally on a big screen. And again, give them a cup of tea and bring them in. And also during the summer holidays, maybe run some children's movies. Most of our hirers returned, which was great. And we formulated a marketing campaign to attract new business. And our marketing campaign included a short but absolutely fantastic video made by a couple of our trustees, and can be seen if you go to the Thruxton Life website. If you just Google Thruxton, it comes up, Thruxton Life website, and look under Memorial Hall, because it really is the most fabulous video. Over the summer, to be honest, this summer just gone, we were beginning to feel pretty good about ourselves and felt very confident for the future. And then, could I have the next slide, please? The energy crisis has hit us. And without any doubt, I think this is now going to do what COVID never did. And I think there is a very real prospect that our hall will close. And I also fear that this will be on the horizon for many, many community centres and village halls in the area, or indeed around the country. If we looked at our energy bill, our electricity bill during our last full trading year, it was about £6,000. We were very lucky. We tied ourselves into a 3-year contract and we were doing very well. But our 3-year contract comes to an end in February. And if we look at the price of electricity as it was 2 weeks ago, which was when we last did the figures, we haven't done them since, because to be honest, I would have had a migraine. But when we looked at the figures 2 weeks ago, our £6,000 annual bill was going to rise to in excess of £12,000, which is completely unsustainable. And I really, as I speak, have no idea what the future will be. But the past has been great, and we look forward to finding a way around what is going to be a very difficult period in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. And I think that's a really pertinent point to end on as well, because as much as we know that the sector has absolutely risen to some phenomenal challenges in the last 21 months, Leah, thank you. It is more than 18 months now. The future does remain uncertain, and we have got a number of challenges coming up. None of it gets easier. There's been some fantastic chat. Again, I'd like to draw people's attention to that. I think Suzanne from the council is talking about different types of funding that are out there. And I think what's wonderful to see is people reaching out to connect and collaborate. So it's fantastic to see that live happening in the room, as it were. We have got time for some questions now. So thank you, those of you who have asked questions through the Q&A, for being so patient. But hopefully you've heard some fantastic responses from our speakers and panelists already. I'll go first to Dave's question. He asks, are there commonalities, so this is probably for Leah, this one, between organisations who have managed to retain pandemic volunteers or have continued to increase volunteer recruitment post-pandemic, which differentiate them from those who have struggled? I don't know if there's any insight in the research so far that would give us any useful lessons that can be shared.
Okay, not in our research necessarily, but it might be helpful to point anyone interested in this to some work that's being done, or has already been done and will continue to be done, by the University of Winchester. They've done, and I'll try after I stop speaking to find the links and put them in. They've done already a couple of pieces of work looking specifically within Hampshire about motivations of volunteers and what motivates people to volunteer. And they're now going to be setting up a kind of continual hub to keep looking at this and to try and look at motivations that for people who don't volunteer or who stop, which is a bit a trickier thing to do, but still very important. Within the research that we've done, because of the way the research was done, which you can find the full details of it in the methodology, not every organization who responded to the questions answered every question, if that makes sense, because we actually, each CVS contacted the organizations within their geographic area, and Action Hampshire contacted county-wide organizations and others that we engage with regularly. And so it's kind of a patchwork. There are a few organizations who have responded to lots of the different factors we've looked at. And so it does make comparisons harder. It's harder for us to segment because the numbers are much smaller and because some people didn't answer the segmenting question. So that's the long way of me saying that I don't quite have anything to say, but I do think that there's some interesting work going on at the University of Winchester, and I will find a link to their existing work right now. The only thing that we did note is that larger organizations seem to be more successful at retaining volunteers. And again, that's probably because they have the capacity to just keep on trying a lot more. When you're a volunteer-run organization yourself, just getting on with doing the tasks that you're assigned with can be difficult enough, never mind trying to convince other people to take that on as well. Whereas, you know, when organizations have the resource, it might be easier.
No, that's brilliant. And actually, if you can find that link now, fantastic. If not, we can make sure it goes into any follow-up that comes out a bit later. And I think that's absolutely right. Large organisations have the capacity. Volunteers sounds like something that's a free resource, but we all know that takes real capacity, real people, real training, and real time. So that's a clear lesson or clear observation there. Julie Amy's asks a brilliant question. I think I'm going to just answer yes to it, but there's probably more to say on it, which is, are there any obvious opportunities for the sector to collaborate? I will say my penny's worth and then hand over to anybody else. But I always think there's always opportunities for the sector to collaborate, and especially as we go through these sorts of challenges, you know, we are quite agile as a sector. We've seen that quick learning, that quick dissemination through these informal kinds of networks and formal networks as well. So anybody else want to comment on that?
I was just going to say that I think there's real value in partnership working, but also recognising that the organisation that that you work for isn't always the best organisation to deliver a piece of work, but there will be someone out there who is. And so when we find funding about things, for example, it's sometimes about just sharing that kind of information with one another as well, because somebody else might be able to benefit from that, even if you can't, because it's not part of what your organisation is working for. I think that, you know, I've worked for lots of different organisations over the years, and, you know, lots of different T-shirts that I've worn. Young people and the public it's not about who you work for, it's about who you are and the relationship you form with people. And it's not for me to say that I'm that best person. There are many others doing other roles in the community, and it's about finding who's the best person and the best organisation to do that piece of work. So sharing that information, supporting one another to keep going, I think is really important.
Thank you. I think that's absolutely it. And I think that kind of goes to one of my other observations, just listening to the three of you actually, is there's that generosity in the sector as well to think about collaboration. And you said something, it doesn't have to be us, Abby, when you were talking. You know, you can spot a need, doesn't mean you need to be the person who steps into that if there's somebody else who's there that's closer and better equipped. Final question is from Diki Fundu, who says, what is the best way to engage with the VCSE sector across Hampshire, Southampton, Isle of Wight and Portsmouth, especially those smaller or unregistered groups? Great question. The CVS network across Hampshire is one way, and there will be CVS organisations there as well. But I will hand over probably to Leah for that question, because we are looking at building a slightly larger network around that geography that will help feed into the health sector, the new integrated care system that will be coming. Leah,
yeah, thanks, Kate. And I know, Dickie, that you work for the NHS, so this will be a particularly useful answer. And I wasn't planning on making any kind of an announcement, so this isn't fully detailed, and I do dread the range of emails I'm now going to receive with everyone wanting to know more about this. But just briefly, across the country, with the introduction of the new integrated care system structures, each area that has an ICS is forming, if they don't have one already, a cross-patch alliance of VCSE organizations to engage structurally with the ICS. So that's a combination of adding some new elements to engage systematically, and then bringing together all of the existing engagement that already happens with NHS colleagues. So it's about identifying what relationships and forums exist, and pulling them together into some sort of engagement process. And so this is something that Action Hampshire is kind of facilitating at the moment, although it's still very early days. And we will be holding a public event about this in early December. So that's when you'll hear more about it, and there'll be some more details, but there will be that future entity that will help. But I'd say also, you know, just reaching out to organizations. There are lots of different thematic groups that already exist if you're interested in a particular group. Each of the CVSs at district level have geographic networks. And I think it would be really interesting to hear from Abby and Kate about how they want to be engaged with as an organization, and to hear their perspectives as well.
Kate, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think integration is all very good. I'm not familiar with ICS, so I can't really comment, but we are a community, as is everybody, and I just think there's always something we can do. There's always something more that we can do, and I think it's fostering people to work together is obviously the key to everything. So nothing in particular, just a general comment about, you know, let's just get together and let's do what we can.
Thank you. Abby, did you have anything on that last point?
No, I think Kate's absolutely right about, you know, the importance of working together and just keeping the conversation going. I think that's what's really important. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, and I can't keep up with the chat, actually. It's been going crazy since we started the Q&As as well. So, but there is lots of connection, lots of things going there, and we will, as Action Hampshire, be going through this afterwards as well, making sure anything that comes out of the chat we're sharing as well. We've only got a couple more minutes, and then we can release everybody back to whatever you've got ready at 11 o'clock. So I want to first of all say a huge thank you to Kate and Abby for joining us today. I've said thank yous already to the Hampshire CVS Network and all the organisations that have contributed to the research. I think it would be really helpful. I mean, do keep this conversation going on Twitter or on Basecamp or on all of the different kind of mechanisms that we've got. There is such a lot that we can learn. And I think, as Kate said, let's get together. You know, we can do this. We do these things best together and in collaboration, not in competition. And so I think there's a huge energy there. In terms of my final thoughts, I would say, you know, the words I've got, and I always do this, I'm listening, I write random words on a piece of paper. I've got well-being, staff, users, volunteers, agility, connection, collaboration, generosity, passion, making a difference. And I think that really does, you know, state the sector, as much as we've had a hammering, as much as the future looks challenging, this is the best of what we are as well. So I think we need to really hold on to that. Other sectors have a lot to learn from us. We are quite different. We work and communicate in different ways, but that is our strength. So I think it's been a brilliant morning. Thank you all for joining us for this. There will be a survey that comes out, as well as links to presentations and other resources as well. So please do take time to fill that survey in. It's really important for us when we're planning our next event. And our next event is next week. So we've got a very short learning curve. So that feedback will be really, really helpful. We've got our AGM next week, where we will be taking some of this conversation forward as well. The theme of that will be on voice within the sector. So how we articulate our voice as a sector, knowing what we know about the communities that we serve, and how we actually bring other people's voice directly into that as well. So we've got some great speakers. It's lovely to see Judith Davy-Cole here today. She will be speaking to us next week as well as part of the advocacy project. And they do voice, that's their thing. So that will hopefully be really exciting. So there will be a link on that other email that comes out. So please do sign up and join us again next week, where we can take, as Leah said, some more thematic parts of this work forward in breakout rooms as well. Thank you very much. I've got 30 seconds left. Bye.